Okay, we're live on YouTube now. So we're still in practice mode. We have 1 minute to go until we begin the webinar. So, um, any last questions?
I think we're pretty set. But Dr. Vitali, is there something particular you did want me to cover?
No, it's really up to you. I would request that your name shows up as Justice for All. You may want to put your actual name, comma, Justice for All. So,
Whenever we sign in through the
and you have my bio for introduction, correct? I presume.
yes, I do. But if you could like the one that we have, I just want to make sure that that's the.
Yeah. Why don't you do the meantime? And I'm listening. So.
It's the Ohio State University one. Is that the one?
Oh. No. Let me then get it to you. Hold on for a second.
There's a Religions of Peace one, but that's from before. Like I think we had.
I'm sending you the link right now. Give me just a second. Here we go. I'm sending you, and you don't have to read all of it. I'm sending it in the chat box here. And only to hosts and panelists. Here is the link. You have that with you in the chat box. So you can only choose of that the portion that you think is appropriate. So. I'm getting one other thing in the meantime, and then I'm ready to go. Is this like a regular program that you do, or is this like a special program?
So this is a special program that we're doing. I do a show on Muslim Network TV that is on justice and peace. And we were thinking of having a follow-up on transnational repression. So I will be in touch with you, and that one is broadcast. So if we do broadcast this, let's see how this goes. This is good. And then we will.
Doing just a couple of things. So.
Okay, we're 1 minute past 5 or 6 if you're on East Coast. I think we should begin. I'm going to start the webinar and the recording, and when you hear the cue that we are recording, that's the cue for Sister Hina to start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Hena Zuberi, and I'm the Director of Advocacy for Justice for All. As many of you may know, we are a human rights organization working primarily on anti-genocide and minority rights work. Many of you may be familiar with our programs such as Burma Task Force, Save Uyghur Campaign, Save India from Fascism, amongst others. And today we are going to be discussing something that has been on our minds, especially as many of us are from the Indian diaspora. We have background or ties to the Indian subcontinent, to South Asia, and several pieces of news and legislation that have been coming out. We wanted to have a thorough discussion about that. And for that, today we have a guest speaker with us, and I'd like to introduce him. Dr.
How are you?
Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Butalia. This is, I wish we could all get together in better times and with a better sometimes it's just like I feel like many of us are getting together when there's something pretty terrible going on in the world. So just let me do a little introduction of you. So Dr. Taranjeet Singh Bhutalia currently serves as the Executive Director of Religions for Peace, USA. He's been a servant leader in the interfaith movement for over 2 decades. He's been a board of trustees of Parliament of World Religions for 12 years, as well as North America Interfaith Network. He's also founding trustee of Sikh Council for Interfaith Relations and serves on the advisory committee of the Global Sikh Council. He currently also serves on the board of Faith and Public Life and the Interfaith Association of Central Ohio. Thank you so much for being here. You've been such a stalwart in this interfaith movement. And today we are going to be talking about a few things. First, on March 16th, 2023, a bipartisan group of United States senators introduced the Transnational Repression Policy Act, which aims to hold foreign governments and individuals accountable when they stalk, intimidate, or assault people across borders, including in the United States. So the bill also establishes countering transnational repression as a foreign policy priority, including in the government's efforts to advance democracy and human rights across the globe. And as for Justice for All, we have been very interested in this bill for a long time. Many of our Uyghur colleagues have been targeted by the Chinese government, including many of our staff. We regularly get calls on our phones asking us to come to the Chinese embassy to pick up material. We've also been harassed and hacked from Burma. Our websites have been targeted. And then, knowing that this legislation builds on a provision that Congress passed in the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year 2020, which focused on transnational repression by way of government's misuse of Interpol data and processes, such as to physically target a dissident located abroad. So this became something of concern for us something for us to watch out for. The Biden administration had also pursued other efforts to counter transnational repression domestically, including through the FBI. And the tactics governments use to target human rights defenders and anyone who speaks up can be physical, such as abductions, or non-physical, such as use of spyware or online harassment. We've had colleagues in the interfaith circle who've had spyware inserted on their phones, including Pegasus. So the intent is from the U.S. government is to control the behavior, control this sort of transnational repression. And the intent on the side of governments who are doing this is to control the behavior of the person being targeted. And we see this as lays out a chilling effect on communities who are rising up and speaking up about these issues. So recently, as many of you have known and heard, there was an assassination in Canada of an Indian Sikh activist, someone who was calling for the self-determination of their land. Also, Indian authorities have been asked to conduct thorough and impartial investigations into the allegation that Indian government agents were involved in assassination plots against Sikhs in the United States and Canada. And we are going to be discussing this in detail with Dr. Singh, Dr. Bhutalia, and really want to ask him more about how this has been impacting the Sikh community for decades. This is not something new. I've heard stories of Sikh friends who have said that they speak at their gurdwaras, and within the hour, their speeches are recorded and sent back to them on their own WhatsApps, letting them know from Indian telephone numbers, letting them know that you're being watched. So, Dr. Butalia, if you could share with us what has transpired, especially for this uproar in the US government, who has recently been targeted in the United States that has really put a spotlight on this issue.
Thank you, Sister Hannah. As you rightfully said, that this authoritarian playbook is used by rogue regimes such as China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And in summary, up front, I should say that now even democracies like India have begun using this authoritarian playbook. And that is why the legislation that you mentioned is so important. I myself came to the US in 1989 to study at The Ohio State University. And about 5 years before I came, in 1984, there had been an incident in the United States in California where a Taiwanese American who was a dissident who had written a book that was critical of the Taiwanese president was killed in a shooting. And the US intelligence agencies quickly figured out that this assassination that occurred in 1984 in October was the work of intelligence agents of the Taiwanese government. They immediately confronted them, and guess what? Within 2 months, the Taiwanese government admitted its role, said it would not happen again, and worked with the US government to put guardrails into place. That is how responsible nations work on fixing such problems. There are always bad apples. But the position that India has taken with the US and Canada, the two cases, and I'll talk more about the details of the cases, but I want to give a broader outline up front and the context. In the first case, in Canada, India simply has denied that they had anything whatsoever. They demanded evidence from Canada. Canada says we have shared the evidence with India. India says we don't have anything. And as a result, in essence, India's response to the allegations from Canada saying that they have a human electronic evidence that the murders were ordered through intelligence agencies in the High Commission of India in Ottawa. Okay? And so India's response has been very self-defensive. They have essentially got into saying, well, Canada promotes, Sikh separatists, and so they've gotten very defensive. In case of the US, India's response has been somewhat different. Because, as you know, that this became public knowledge when the charges were filed in a court case that we have in the US. And I've read those transcripts that talk about, how the conversations happening between the US informant and the person who was being directed by the senior intelligence officer out of India. There is a record of those that talks about what they've done. It's a very detailed one. In India's response now has been, well, we will look into it. But there was a very interesting response that India gave to it. And that was that as a policy, we do not do such things abroad. It was quite interesting to me that the response said that this is our policy, but it never said that our intelligence agencies did not do this. So it's what was said and what was not said is important. Now, as you said that it has been at least since the 1980s that it is well known within the Sikh community in the West that in nearly every Gurdwara, there is an informant who does inform the local Indian high commissions of what happens at the Gurdwara, what lectures are given. This, in fact, was told to me by an ex-intelligence officer many, many years ago on a late night when he had too much of alcohol. And I was still in my senses because I'm not taking alcohol. So he said, we get this report. So what Sister Hannah, you just said, I actually had an intelligence officer admit to me, even though he thought he had not had too much, but I think he did. And, he was able to, and I'm like, wow. And, that's when it struck me that this web actually goes deep. And there is, in most countries, as you are aware, many of the officials that come to the embassies are intelligence officers, and that goes for every country. So that monitoring is one part. The second is to use that monitoring then to intimidate nationals of other countries for your own country's national interest. And that is where I think this overall scheme that India has put together, which I think is also important to remember that this timing is one in which uh, there is a very strong Hindu nationalist government in India that wants to create a Hindu nation. And I find it quite ironic that any calls for a Sikh nation are anti-national, but calls for a Hindu nation are considered to be patriotic. I wonder why such difference. But keeping that aside, where all this, I believe, began from, and I will share for you and our attendees today, the intercept, and I hope you can see this on my screen, and if you don't, just let me know, Sister Hannah.
Yeah.
Intercept, about 2 weeks ago, put out an article that you may have read that talked about a secret memo that had been sent to the different high commissions of India across the Western countries. They had reviewed that, and that had asked that Sikh activists be targeted. Now, this memo, the Indian government, Ministry of External Affairs, first denied it ever existed. And now this memo has become public. And because it's already publicly available, I simply got a copy of that, and I'm sharing from what the Indian government wrote to its embassies. And what I've done is I've highlighted some parts that are in red that would help your attendees understand the context. And then I'll talk about from April 2023 onwards, in June, Nijjar's murder, and then what happened to Gurpratwant Singh. So if you see, this is a memo from the Foreign Office, Ministry of External Affairs, and it's sent to the one in Ottawa, the High Commission of India in Ottawa. It's going to them April 2023, and copies of it have been sent to others. Now look where it is going. It is also being sent to the Consul Generals of different other cities in Canada and the US. So clearly, this memo is targeted towards Canada and the US. We're talking about April. And the memo claims that Khalistanis are in these countries, there are about 1 million Sikhs. And this implies that a vast majority of Sikhs indeed, and when I say Khalistanis, what is meant by is that they are willing to use violent means for creating Khalistan. There are those who believe in the right to self-determination as accepted by the United Nations, but it has to be done in a peaceful, democratic way, not through violence. One of the organizations in the memo that is listed is Sikhs for Justice. And this is and look, they are number one listed. This is the organization that Mr. Nijjar, who was gunned down in June of this year in Vancouver, was from, as well as Gurpratwant Singh Pannu also works for the same organization in the US. Let me go on. It's quite interesting that the memo claims that the Khalistani organizations or Sikhs have been working, and top officials, primarily important countries, means US and Canada in particular, are actually providing a guiding hand to the Khalistani elements. It's quite interesting to me that in India, they claim that this is being done by Pakistan. But in this memo, Pakistan is absolved of that crime, right? See what I mean? I thought it was quite interesting. It's what is not here in the memo also interested me, that in Indian media, constantly they talk about this being done by Pakistan. Over here, there is no mention of Pakistani people. It says that the Western countries are providing a guiding hand. I mean, that's a serious accusation against the West, especially US and Canada. And then it further says that when India raised this with US and Canada, that our countries raise issue of human rights and freedom of speech. Of course, we would raise that because the US and Canada do care about human rights and freedom of speech. Everyone has a right for self-determination through a peaceful means, through a proper democratic process. And Struggle for Justice has been doing these various referendums where Sikh communities are in majority to see how many Sikhs would be interested in such a separate independent nation that they would have. So Khalistan now and the Khalistanis has been used as a slur against Sikhs. That anybody who believes that Sikhs should have an independent state by default, first is a separatist, then becomes a terrorist. And once that's done, then you are essentially dehumanized and you can be eliminated. So Nijar as well as Gurpatwant Singh Pannu, both of them fell into the same category. And now it's interesting, this is what it is calling for in April, that the folks who work for the embassy, they should work in coordination with the intelligence bureau. The NIA is India's internal national investigative agency, and RAW is the intelligence agency that does spying work outside of India. So it's clearly calling them to work in collaboration with all of these agencies to be able to keep an eye on the Sikh community and to use the beating stick of Khalistan to beat down on the Sikh community. And of course, you have the name of Hardeep Singh Najjar again, particularly shows up in this memo. I want to share this background with all of you because we are talking, this is now April of 2023. It was in middle of June when, in fact, June 18th, when Hardeep Singh Najjar was killed in Vancouver. I had a scheduled conference in Vancouver, in Surrey, the city where he was shot, a week or 10 days after this incident happened. And I remember being there, and nearly everyone in that community was saying, well, we think we know who it is. And I'm like, who is it? And they said, we suspect the Indian government. So the local community there already had an idea and a suspicion of what was going to happen. Now, let's remember, this was much before the allegations made and the claims made by Justin Trudeau in the Canadian Parliament. So that suspicion had already been in place.
I have a question here. Why? So could you expand on that? Tell us more about the reaction of the community at that point, and why did they feel this way? I know you have told us about intelligence agents being in Gurdwaras, but I want to know more about what are the feelings of people in just average Sikhs who hear this news, know this news. How do they feel living here, either in the US or Canada?
My sense is that a lot of our community is fearful. And part of the reason this is done is to make those within the Sikh community who would want to speak up to simply self-censor themselves. But as we found out here in the US, that our intelligence agencies were a step ahead, and our government took the proper action to thwart the plot against the life and liberty of Mr. Pannu, who is a Canadian US citizen. All the people we are talking about are not Indian citizens. Hardeep Singh Najjar was a Canadian citizen. We had Pannu was Canadian Sikh. Now, this all began with a suspicion that happened in May. And I should point this out. In May of 2023, in Lahore, Pakistan, a Sikh activist, Paramjit Singh Panjwar, was killed in a drive-by shooting. So that is how this all began. Now, there's a reason why I shared the April 2023 memo. It seems that that is the point at which a decision might have been made to go ahead and implement these transnational killings in other countries. And then right around mid-June, when Hardeep Singh Nijjar was killed, there was also an alleged poisoning of another Sikh activist, Avatar Singh Khanda, who also worked for Struggle for Justice, which the UK police initially claimed had been fully investigated, and now they have actually backtracked. So, and this is when Trudeau then came up, and in September of this year, when he raised the issues with regard to the information that they had, India's response, as I said, was very defensive. But now that the US has actually filed a lawsuit against an Indian national who was being handled by what the lawsuit calls a co-conspirator, a senior intelligence officer who used to work for India's paramilitary forces previously. And a lot of the ex-army and paramilitary persons then actually go into the intelligence agency or RAW, and many of them get posted out to the different consulates and commissions that the India has all of, and most countries do that. So, but what is typically done is that if any country targets the citizens of that country, it is generally done in consultation with that country. It is not done around them. But in this case, obviously, counterintelligence is what caught all this together. And even Canada has almost admitted that the evidence for Nijjar's murder that most probably came from the US. And the reason why this is all tied up is that in the court case that the US government filed, they have a communication between the handler who was in between Indian citizen and the senior intelligence officer one day after Nijjar is killed. Then now that Nijjar has been killed, now it is time to move and kill Guru Patwant Singh Pannu. So now we do have evidence. So now what is happening is there is so much of smoke. Now there is clearly a fire. And the Sikh community at this time, you can imagine, how secure the Sikh community would be in India, where these kinds of rights are simply not available. And so Sikh community at this time, at least I know in Canada, they are a lot more nervous because foreign interference in Canada has been a much bigger issue up till now than the US. The Sikh community, I think, in the US is a lot more confident, and we are a much smaller community here compared to Canada, that we are able and our government is able to take care of our interests and our security. But there are some, I consider myself a Sikh activist too. The question is, at what point does Sikh activist become a terrorist or a Khalistani? And according to Indian government is, if you believe in a separate state, doesn't matter what means you use, whether it is peaceful means or violent means. And so that is the broad brush with which the Indian government, I believe, has operated in the US and Canada.
And this is exactly like, I just wanted to, for those in our audience who might be watching who don't know some of the details behind this, when the indictment for conspiracy to commit murder, while it didn't name the intended target of the plot, it was widely reported to be someone. And so who is the Counsel General, as Dr. Butalia spoke about, the Sikhs for Justice. Now, the group advocates for having a Punjab's, secession of Punjab state from India to create an independent nation of Khalistan for Sikhs, which Sikhs are a minority religious group in the country. And so the alleged plot was foiled by the US authorities, according to prosecutors in the case. Now, the public indictment refers to the Indian government official as a CC1 or a senior field officer, with responsibilities in security management and intelligence, and which is Gupta, right? Like we've been talking about him. And he allegedly was working.
Let me correct you. It's not Gupta. is the in-between person between the senior intelligence officer, which is CC1, and the informant in the US who was being asked to carry out the murder and was given a cash advance through Gupta. So this senior intelligence officer didn't do it directly, but worked through this Indian national Gupta to arrange for an assassin.
Yes, exactly. So Gupta, who was allegedly working on the direction of the Indian agent, contacted an individual that he believed was a criminal associate for help to contract a hitman for the murder. But the associate was actually a confidential source working for the US law enforcement. And the hitman was an undercover US law enforcement officer. So it's like an God, like this could be a Bollywood, Hollywood movie.
Exactly.
How intricate, like you think you just read about this stuff or you watch it in a movie, but this is like real life and it's happening to people. And what is even more scarier is that the indictment also alleges that Gupta was linked to the killing of Nijjar in Canada. And he allegedly told the undercover US law officer on an audio call that Nijjar was the target, and we have, quote unquote, so many targets.
Yeah, at least 10 is what it referred to.
And separately, according to US prosecutors, Gupta also confirmed that Nijjar was the target he previously mentioned as the potential Canadian job, saying that eventually some other guy did this job in Canada. So then now, as Dr. Battaglia pointed out, that the Indian government lists both Nijjar and Pannu as terrorists under their counterterrorism legislation. And this is where it gets really murky, and who gets to decide what that means, what boundaries need to be crossed. It doesn't seem to be any sort of like anything that people can point out, like don't cross this line and otherwise you will enter into that territory. And so that puts the entire Sikh community at risk because, as Dr. Battaglia said, it could be anybody. Anybody speaking up for their rights, asking for self-determination, whether they're Kashmiris, whether they're Sikhs, whether they're Indian Muslims, whether they're Indian Christians. And what is also really, really problematic is that the allegations of the Indian government's involvement in these targeted killings abroad come amidst increasing, reports of serious human rights violations against activists in India. The BJP-led government has attempted to silence dissent using intimidation, harassment of critics through raids and arbitrary arrests. Amnesty International, there are several NGOs have been targeted. So, and they use the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and this is their main counterterrorism law. And because when this act is used, there is no
It has a presumption of being guilty. And typical laws generally in liberal democracies assume the innocence of the person, but this is a law that allows a person to be detained. And what is done is India will detain somebody under this Unlawful Prevention Act for 1 year. The person is released, and as soon as the person is released, it is again done for another year. And this repression, what is interesting is only used against religious minorities. I wonder why there are only Muslim terrorists and Sikh terrorists, whereas there are only Hindu fundamentalists. You never in the Indian media will you see the word terrorist will always be associated with Muslim and Sikh, but never with a Hindu nationalist. Look at the language. Sikh terrorist and Muslim terrorist, but a Hindu nationalist. I'm like, wow, what double standards. Now, part of the challenge, I think, Sister Hannah, has been that from a larger perspective, the experiment of democracy, I believe, has been a success in the last 50 to 70 years. looking at countries across the world in terms of economic prosperity. However, let me be very clear. I think democracies today have found legal ways to repress religious minorities. Look at the Trump ban on Muslim entering the US, part of which was upheld by a Supreme Court. Let us not forget that. Okay? The point I want to make is that religious minorities, India claims that its laws on the books are wonderful. And I would agree with that India does have laws on the books. There are some laws like the one you referred to that are used for repression. In general, India does allow for life, liberty, and happiness. However, in practice, those laws are not enforced, particularly when it comes to religious minorities. And that is the fundamental challenge. So democracy, including India today, have found legal means to suppress and oppress religious minorities. Now, the Sikh case is, and I also want your readers to understand what is the problem the Indian government has with Sikhs. There must be something, right? Why are Sikhs such a threat to the Indian nation? And to unpack that, I want to go back to a little history lesson. In 1849 is when the British conquered Punjab. And at that time, it was a Sikh kingdom. And when the British were leaving in 1947, quitting South Asia, they decided to divide Punjab into India and Pakistan. And there were some Sikhs at that time who would have preferred that Punjab remain together as an independent nation, which also would be consisting of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, all three. So when folks talk about, and this is very similar to, I know that Jinnah talked about Pakistan. He didn't think of Pakistan as a fundamentalist Islamic state. He saw Pakistan as a progressive Muslim state where Muslims could experience the glow of freedom. He was very pragmatic. Now, Gandhi would tell Jinnah that one person, one vote. Jinnah, I think, was smart enough to see that one person, one vote means that Muslims in India over time would be suppressed and oppressed. Guess what? Looking at what Modi is doing to Muslims in India, I think Jinnah's assessment was indeed on the mark. He knew that if it was one person, one vote, that would happen. Okay? So the Sikh community asked for an independent state. And that is when I think the first time the word Khalistan was used. And backtracking to, there is also this, culture and religion do come together and intermingle. The Sikh faith, when it began, was very much opposed to Brahminical practices and has significant differences with the Hindu tradition and has things in common like it does with Islam. The dominant traditions at that time were Islam and Hinduism. We as Sikhs believe our faith to be an independent world religion. However, ever since the formation of the faith, especially today and over time, I would say about 95% of Hindus view the Sikh faith's independence as being a threat. In their mind, we are Hindus. And so, we were put together to oppose the Mughals. The Mughals are now gone. So you are our brothers. Come back and be a part of us. What are you upset about? The moment Sikhs say that we are not Hindu, we are an independent religion, you immediately are now put in the category of what I would call a separatist. So, a good Sikh in India is one who is willing to worship idols, even though our scripture says that, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, all three lived in ego or home, be that as it may. So, good Sikh is one who is willing to accept that the Sikh tradition is part of a Hindu tradition. That is a good Sikh. And then there is the undesirable or the separatist, like me, who believes that Sikh faith is an independent world religion. So now what you have is you have this clash coming. Number three, Sikhs happen to live in a bordering state with Pakistan. So every time the Sikh community asks for something, it has always been viewed with suspicion. Why do they want it? When India, in independent India, Nehru had linguistic states, different ones. Punjab was the very, very last linguistic state in the 1960s to be formed. With all this, there were Sikhs in India who raised the demand of a separate Sikh state. And there were those who said, no, it is better to work within the system and get more rights within India. So these two movements began in the 1980s. As the 1980s proceeded, in Punjab, there was a significant impetus to be able to secure more rights for the Sikh community within India. And I'm talking about 1980 to 1984. So the struggle was not for Khalistan. The struggle was to get more rights for Sikhs within India. And that's where the natural place to do this would be. The response of the Indian government instead was saying, you want a separate state of Khalistan and you are conspiring with Pakistan. So even Sikh demands for Punjab, for the farmers, okay, the needs were viewed and put in the category of Khalistan. So now you can see in the 1980s, Khalistan was used as a beating stick. So Sikhs in India could not ask for anything for Punjab or the Sikh or the Punjabi community. And that pattern has continued. As you might be aware, in the last couple of years, there had been these farmer protests in India. And same thing. What was Indian government's response? Oh, these are Khalistanis. They want a separate nation. But in the end, they had to give in because other religious communities came together with the farmers from Rajasthan, the farmers from Haryana, came together with farmers from Punjab and worked together. Now, what happened in the 1980s until the 1995 and a little bit later is India, in essence, used this beating stick issue of Khalistan to root out any kind of demands for securing Sikh rights within India. And once that happens, it did drive some Sikh groups to go and say that we do want Khalistan. Some would ask with violent means, other would ask with peaceful means. Then the repression of the government was a typical pattern of mopping villages, picking up young men. And Jaswant Singh Khalra in the middle 1990s published data. He actually went to crematoriums across Punjab and he compiled how many unclaimed bodies the police brought to be burned. Because once a person is killed, that person has to be disposed of. What did the folks do in the Nazi Holocaust? That's exactly what was done. In this case, he put together a list of 20,000 unclaimed bodies that the Punjab police of Sikh young men had brought and they had been burned. And how he found out was because to burn a person, you have to pay for wood. The police would kill these young Sikh men in faked encounters and pay that money for wood for that person to be burned. Jaswant Singh Khalra himself was picked up by the police and he himself also was killed in a faked encounter. In essence, any demand for Sikh rights within India was severely repressed. So the only place that it had survived was abroad. And I would say that within India, Khalistan is used as a very prerogative word against me. Calling somebody a Khalistan in India is like, hurling an abuse of somebody. Hena, also for those of us from there, it is calling somebody a Pakistani is worse than being called a Khalistan. But I'm saying these are prerogative words that are used to dehumanize people. Okay? Anybody who goes to Pakistan more than once or twice, oh, you become a Pakistani. Oh, if you're Sikh, you've got to be a Khalistan. So with all this coming together, I think Sikhs in India really have two choices. Either they work to get more rights within India itself, That path has been shown repeatedly not to work, because the issue, every time Sikhs raise those rights, they are called anti-national. And once that is done, then all kind of repression can be used, and then Panwa and Nijar both can be declared a terrorist, and that's where the question you began from. It's in an arbitrary determination to control and beat on other people so that the larger community can be channelized and controlled. But the basic issue at the bottom is this independence of the Sikh faith from the Hindu faith. We have great respect and regard for the Hindu tradition. Yet, our Sikh gurus in our scripture talk about, the Trinity, for example, of the Hindu community, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, in ways that is not even glorified. And so, for a Sikh to raise these issues that we are not Hindus and we are different, we have different set of values. Appearance, of course, then comes after that, but even in terms of fundamental values that we have and the beliefs, it is considered to be separatist. So that is where the community is today, is to make a decision whether they want more rights within India or a separate independent nation. My personal opinion, Sister Hannah, is that the time to make independent nations based on one religion is over. We also see challenges. Nearly every country that we see across the world that is based on one religion has challenges today. And I'm not making a statement of one religion. I'm talking about all religious traditions. The future is a confederation in South Asia. And the pathway forward is that Europe amongst itself fought for hundreds of years, and now we have the European Union. I think South Asia will also come together. But the people who live in Punjab, both on the Indian and the Pakistani side, have, especially those of us who live in the diaspora now, have a significant role to play, because India and Pakistan will only be able to reconcile if Sikh Punjabis and Hindu Punjabis from the Indian side of Punjab and Muslim Punjabis from Pakistan side of Punjab can come together, because our language is different, is same, our culture is the same. If we cannot reconcile with each other, how will somebody from Balochistan in Pakistan and Gujarat in India, who have nothing in common culturally, be able to do? And so this is the reason why the Sikh community can be a bridge, along with the Muslim community of Pakistan, of more friendship, mutual regard between India and Pakistan. And I am convinced that day will happen. It probably won't happen in my lifetime, but it will happen. There are friends who have asked me, Hannah, that if looking at what has happened in the US and Canada, does that impact me and what I do? I actually say that it's done the reverse effect on me. As you might be aware, that I have written 2 articles, and I'm putting them, in fact, in the chat box for you and our attendees, and they were published in Religion News Service. The first one I wrote was when Trudeau talked about the case of Niger, and then recently I wrote another one, which is looking at transnational extrajudicial murders. The one thing, and I know we're closing into time, we may take some questions from the audience. One thing I do want to make sure we understand, that what is going on right now is not only transnational extrajudicial murders by India. What is behind this is globalist religious nationalism. It is this rise of right-wing Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva, in India that is driving it. And this already came to America, in fact, several years ago. So right-wing Hindu nationalism is not only a challenge from India, it is now a significant part of the Indian community diaspora here in the United States also. And so a lot of the interactions that you have, and I have many good Hindu friends who see nothing wrong with India being a Hindu nation. And I'm like,
that may be a separate discussion you know, with a country that big, with so many different languages and so many different faiths living together, many in our audience would not know that India has the largest Muslim population in the world now, bigger than Indonesia. So, yeah.
But if I can make one comment, I've lived in the US for 35 years. I've traveled to South Asia, India, and Pakistan. Oh gosh, I can't even count how many times. What I will tell you, sister, is that unfortunately, I have come to the conclusion that the African Americans of our country here in the US have generational poverty, are, I believe, the most oppressed people in our country. The same is true for Muslims in India and Christians in Pakistan. Interesting how the community changes, but we always oppress. And the only people who prefer the status quo are those who oppress. The status quo is important to those who oppress others. So what we find is all of these are democracies, right? But in each case, you have a community which is dispossessed, which has generational poverty.
So I'd like to, I know we don't have much time left, and I'd like to go back to our topic of transnational repression. The Washington Post recently published an article on the online reporting that an organization linked to Indian intelligence agencies use the work that, you know, if people are doing work here, that humanitarian groups or Indian American rights activists, for example, they're Indian American or they're Americans of different, you know, different ethnicities who are working on human rights in India, and they have put unsubstantiated claims to paint US government figures, researchers, activists as part of a conspiracy.
Like for human rights.
Global, yeah, global, they say it's by global Islamic groups and it's by billionaire George Soros, and to undermine and break up India. So that's the goal of these people in the United States. So do you think that this repression will stop, or do you think that we're going to continue to see more targeted attacks here in US or Canada?
My sense, sister, is that now that this has become a public issue, okay, and there was some smoke that happened when the Canadian Prime Minister spoke. Then when the US spoke up and the actual evidence that came out with the filing of the court case that was done here in the US, and now this memo that came out, I don't see how India can continue to operate under this policy. I think they have been exposed. And my sense is that they are backtracking, but the way this would be done is important because the first step is India needs to admit that they did this and then work with the Canadian government and work with the US government to put guardrails into place so this is not repeated. And they also need to extend an apology to the Sikh community for what they have done, especially the families of the activists who have been killed and targeted. I think that is the pathway forward. There is an honorable path that the land of Gandhi can take. But poor Gandhi must be turning over in his grave looking at what Modi is doing currently in India.
So we have a few minutes left, so we're going to take questions from the audience at this point. You can raise your hand and let us know if you have a question, or you can type it in the chat. And then, so if you have questions for Dr. Battalia at this point. Sadaf, do you have a question? You can ask it online if you have a question right now. Trying to unmute her. So Dr.
Yes, sorry, I don't know what happened. Did I raise my hand by accident?
Perhaps.
Oh, sorry.
Now that you're online, you might as well ask me a question.
I'll come to it.
There's a question, Doctor. Do you think that the beginning of Sikh repression began with the killing of Bhindranwale and Operation Blue Star in the 80s?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. Like I said, this repression began in the 1950s when the Sikh community asked for more rights for Punjab, a place where the language and the script of the Sikh community could be preserved. So it began all the way from 1960s. Operation Blue Star, very interestingly, there is Joyce Pettigrew has written very well. She is a professor in University of Notre Dame. And she writes in her book that the army did not go into the Darbar Sahib during Operation Blue Star to kill Bhindranwale. It was to kill the spirit of a community. A dear friend of mine, his father was a deputy commissioner of Amritsar one day before Operation Blue Star. And once he came to know the plans, I understand he conveyed very directly to the Prime Minister of India, my friend told me, his dad, that Bhindranwale comes out of the Golden Temple complex. He used to live in a building behind the Golden Temple complex, and that I can arrest him any day. Okay? It was a lie that he lived in the complex, but the response he got was that our objective is not to capture and kill Bhindranwale. Okay? And overnight, he was transferred. And next morning, when the operation began, there was a new deputy commissioner that came into place. So this repression began in the 1960s. But the place where it has its roots, very important to understand, is the independence of the Sikh faith from the Hindu tradition, while we respect it like any other religious tradition as Islam and others in the world.
Mohammed has a question. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bhattaria, for joining this nice presentation, and we learned a lot. So I have a question, and I kind of see your optimism, and that gives us hope for sure. But the way it is right now, this Hindutva ideology and this BJP and RSS regime, the way they are pushing all the extremist idea, not only actually on Sikhs for sure, but also Indian Muslims, 200 million Muslims there, and other religion like Christian.
And also on Hindus who don't agree with them.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Yeah. So the way it is going, unfortunately, I'm an optimist person, but the direction they're going towards with this Hindutva ideology, and as you know more than me for sure, the undivided India, it is like the Akhand Bharat, like all those things they're doing, it is not only going to create a risk or like this huge humanitarian crisis for all the other population in India, but also this entire South Asia actually. So while I want to be more optimistic for sure, but this Hindutva ideology, the way they are expanding their claws now in Canada, now in America, and in all these American cities, New Jersey, everywhere, like in their states, they are actually expanding. So how do we can be more optimistic at this time with this ever-growing Hindutva ideology, and then all these people are getting more into extremist ideas and extremist activities in India. So how do we see? Help us to see the optimism in this case.
Brother, the rise of religious nationalism has now been a phenomenon across the world. Look at the rise of Christian nationalism here in the US that Trump directly and indirectly promotes. Modi, in fact, has done better. Modi knows the playbook a lot better in terms of Hindu nationalism. In essence, the objective is to get votes. Now, As Brother Muhammad that you said, that initially the repression by the Modi government was primarily on religious minorities. Now it is happening on human rights activists and secular Hindus, which are now a significant component of the opposition to Modi. So that is where I think the hope lies. In the end, the secular Hindus will have to stand up to Modi. Now, gosh, this was about 2 years ago. I'll give you an incident that happened. I'm visiting Pakistan, and there was this old man. I didn't think he was very learned also. And that time when we were still a very Trumpian country, not that we are not any right now. But he said that India and the US should not go down the path of what Pakistan has done. And of course, he was speaking to me in Urdu, but I want to keep in English. I said, what do you mean? He said that, do you remember what the Taliban did to Pakistan? And I said, of course I remember that. But he said, remember, one day the wind in Pakistan changed. He said, do you know when that happened? I said, of course I remember the attack on the school in Peshawar. He says, on that one day, the wind changed in Pakistan. And his point to me was that India and the US both should not repeat the mistake of Pakistan. He says, please, please, please don't repeat our mistake, but learn from the lessons that we have learned. Because this road of religious nationalism will lead you down to a path of destruction of your own country and your own values and your own soul. So, brother, my sense is that this rise of secular Hindus and religious Hindus who oppose this extremist and exclusive ideology in India and abroad, I think, are the hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Battalion. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for more questions. I would say from the behalf of Justice for All, thank you so much for being here. And our positioning is that Indian authorities need to stop targeting activists and dissidents at home and abroad, and instead uphold international and constitutional obligations to protect the rights to life and liberty, freedom from torture, freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and the right to a fair trial. The Indian government needs to do more than issue denials in response to alleged involvements in grave abuses abroad and at home. And the authorities need to stop silencing critics and allow security forces to commit violations with impunity. What we are hearing from the US government right now is that for the first time, there is an opening in many, many years that people are willing to listen to activists on India. They're finally waking up and realizing, how dare India do this to us? When did the situation and the positioning change so much that the government of India thought they could get away with doing this to a US citizen? So I urge everybody who is involved in and cares about India, cares about minority rights in India, cares about keeping peace in South Asia, to get involved, to go and meet your Congress people and educate them about religious freedom and human rights and the state of what is happening in India under this extremist regime.
Sister, I really appreciate Justice for All putting this together, and I know you do a lot of meaningful work across the world, and I would just leave your attendees today with one reflection, that much of the world is getting ready to celebrate the birth of a child born a long time ago in Palestine. But the world doesn't care about the children of Palestine being bombed and killed today. We have a lot of work to do, sister, together. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Good night.
Good night.